Hello, good evening. I'm Sean, the president of the Oxford and Cambridge Society, Malaysia, and I'd like to welcome you all to our first event of 2023 entitled Demystifying ESG Overview, Concepts, and Trends. Personally, I have no idea what ESG is. Last week, we ran a poll in our Exco WhatsApp group on what the E, S, and G stood for, and we all got it wrong. So I think that everyone is unfamiliar with it and is interested to find out what it is all about. To enlighten us this evening are Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, Dr. Kishore Ravuri, and Professor Rene Banares-Alcantara. And I hope that we will all finally learn what the fuss is all about. This webinar will be moderated by our Exco member, Sharifah. Over to you, Sharifah.
Thank you very much, Sean. A very good evening, good afternoon to Rene, and Assalamualaikum to everyone. A warm welcome to the Oxford and Cambridge Society's maiden ESG webinar, Demystifying ESG, Overview, Concepts and Trends. As Sean alluded to just now, we have a vibrant set of audience, all dialed in from all over, ranging from our members, ESG practitioners, corporate employees, even students are here. A shout out to my fellow Agenta stars and a shout out to students from KTJ as well. Welcome to all of you. I'm Sharifah, and I will be your moderator for this evening. So my dear audience, as Sean mentioned just now, this is actually a very, very grey topic. It's been receiving a lot of attention around the globe, ESG. The term has grown in importance here in Malaysia as well. And I guess one reason that's given it a lot of importance is the climate change phenomenon, which is affecting all our lives. Global warming, floods, earthquakes, it's all brought an urgency for us to start thinking about how we can save our environment, save the planet. So ESG, hence, has entered discussions at offices of lawmakers, boardrooms, seminars, universities, even schools, as a way for us to start thinking about how we can do our part to tackle the issues that surrounding us. But ladies and gentlemen, actually ESG is not just about E. It's also about the S and the G factors. And our three speakers are going to be talking to us, deconstructing each one of these alphabets. But yet myths surround it. Too many alphabets in the soup, way too many jargons. So let me first introduce you to our speakers who are going to be speaking to us today on this very, very important topic. So first up, we have Professor Rene Banares-Alcantara, who is dialing in from cold Oxford. Rene is a reader in engineering science at the University of Oxford. He's a chemical engineer with a Bachelor of Engineering degree from Mexico, and he holds Masters and PhD in the same field from Carnegie Mellon University. He's currently working on a very interesting research on green ammonia, which I hope he will talk about more later. Welcome, Rene, and happy to have you here with us. Next up, we have Dr. Kishore Ravuri, Head of Sustainability from Dutch Lady Milk Industries Berhad, and he's also a leading sustainability practitioner in Malaysia. He was also one of the founders of the CEO Action Network, a network of CEOs who are very, very passionate about making change in the climate agenda. Dr. Kish is also affiliated with the University of Cambridge Institute of Sustainability and Leadership. Welcome, Kish. And our rose among the thorns is the lovely Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, Chairperson and Director of Climate Governance Malaysia. It's a chapter of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance Initiative. Datin Sri holds various board positions and is also a fellow at the Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia. Welcome, Datin Sri. I hear you're dialing in from Bangkok. Good to have you here. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I know everyone is eager to listen to our speakers. A couple of things that's keeping you between them and what they're going to be saying. So very quick housekeeping rules. You'll have a chance to ask questions to our speakers. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box and then we will direct your questions to the speakers. I have got my fellow Agenda stars who have dialed in as well. Please take a screenshot of your participation and then upload it onto our Learn so that you can have it recorded under your learning development credits. So thank you to all of you for joining us. Now, before we go into before we listen to the speakers, we thought we'll run a simple quiz. Now, if I can have everyone take out your phone and just scan the code that is appearing on your screen at the moment. We're going to run a Slido quiz. If I could have everyone participate, let's give it a few minutes to see all the names appearing, and then we can run the poll. Hello, names are filling out. I see some very familiar names there as well. Keep it coming. Give a few more seconds before we'll see the screen fill up, and then we can start the poll. Oh, vibrant audience. Full house almost. A few more seconds, and then we'll push questions. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna show you the first question. Here we go. What is ESG? In your answers, audience, do look at your phone because there could be a lag between what's appearing on your screen and what's appearing on your phone. It looks simple, but I think this is a little bit of a trick question. Yeah, most people have answered the second option. Indeed, it is environmental, social, and governance. Well done. Now, next question. Complete the following sentence. Sustainability is meeting the needs of the present without ... Could be a bit confusing as well, but I think the answer is just glaring at everyone. Okay, let's have a look how everyone's answered. But split between the first and the second. Actually, it's without compromising the ability of the future generation to meet their own needs. Okay, on to the third question. Which of the following produces net zero? We've heard net zero a lot, right? We have students in the audience, a bit mathematical here. Let's see if you can get this right. Net zero. Well, I struggle to answer this question myself, and let's see how has everyone responded. Oh, interesting. Yeah, most people said it's emissions minus carbon credit net zero. Actually, the answer is emissions minus absorption equals to net zero. What you put out, what you absorb, you balance it, net zero. Learn something today. All right, on to the final question now. The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG as they are more commonly known, was launched by which entity, when, in which year, and how many goals do they comprise? Yeah, this can be a bit tricky as well, but let's see how we all respond. Okay, the answer is actually the United Nations in 2016, 17 goals. Okay, well done, everyone. I hope we all learn something through this quiz today. It was great to see how everybody responded to the questions that we had. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the most exciting part of our evening, which is presentation by our speakers. So our speakers are actually going to first give us definitions of the term ESG. Now, let's start with some context. And I want to start with Prof. Rene. Now, Prof. Rene, I would like to start with the alphabet E. Now, could you provide some view on what it is, what it means, and why is it important? So over to you, Rene. Is he on mute, Sean? Are we able to?
He's on mute.
Sorry. Very clear.
Yeah, okay, good.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so I'll start again. Thank you very much, Sharifah, for the invitation. It's very exciting to be here. And as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the letter E, about the environment. And the one thing that I would start saying is that environment includes both inanimate and living organisms. In particular, in the case of inanimate, we're talking about the air, water in their different forms, and land. And in terms of the biosphere, that is the plants and animals living in planet Earth, is also part of, say, the environment. And this is very important because one of the bits of the environment that is being affected by the climate crisis is biodiversity. Now, this environment is being affected by human activities. Those are called anthropogenic activities, and pretty much anything we do as a society does have an effect on the environment. So how we produce our energy, where do we source the energy, the food we eat, the water we drink, where do we bring it, how do we process it, etc. Once we make use of the different materials, how do we deal with the waste? Pollution is something that is not desirable, obviously, but it's a side effect many times of these human activities. And one other factor that, at least in the past, was not that clear what its effect was, is the change in land use. If you move from having an original forest into some other type of use, for example, to grow corn or wheat or some other, or raise cattle in there, that's going to have an effect on the environment. So what can we do about it? What should we do about it is to try to conserve that environment, because we are part of it. Without it, we will not be able to generate food and water and energy, etc. And in the cases where it has been degraded, we need to restore it. I think one very interesting and useful idea is this idea that there is no planet B. We live on Earth. If Earth gets degraded, then all of us are going to suffer. These ideas that we could just migrate to Mars or some other planet, if at all possible, it would only work for a few thousand people, I suppose. But we're billions now, and we should be working on in terms of that. Can we move to the next slide? I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on part of this environment problem, which is climate change, and how the so-called greenhouse gases, GHG, affect the climate, the environment. And these are gases that, because of their molecular structure, they can trap the heat from the sun, and therefore they act as a greenhouse. Now, the problem with this is that the gas we always hear about is carbon dioxide, which is the first one in the table I put in there. But there are many other gases that have the same effect, if not worse. In terms of per molecule, they will have more detrimental effect. So CO2 is the most popular one in terms of trying to be mitigated and controlled, because it is by quantity the main gas, out in the atmosphere, causing this. Now, you can see that there are two other columns in this table, and it talks about the CO2 equivalent, which means that another molecule, one single molecule of another substance, may have a number of times the same effect as one molecule of CO2. So we move on to methane, for example, which is produced by cattle and the waste in landfill, oil and gas industry, etc. As you can see, we have 83 times the potency of CO2. So one molecule of of methane is equivalent to one molecule of CO2, a lot more potent. And we can go down on that list to nitrous oxide and hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, so on and so forth. And you can see that as I go down the list, in fact, their equivalency is a lot higher. In one case, 17,000 times more potent than CO2. Now, the last column in there actually measures that equivalency over 100 years' time. And what happens is that many of these molecules decompose after some time in the atmosphere. And when they decompose, they stop being a greenhouse gas. And this is why, for example, methane at 20 years, life cycle has an 83 equivalency, whereas at 100 years, it has decreased to 10 because most of it has decomposed. But for example, the man-made fluorocarbons are pretty much very stable, and therefore they will hardly decompose. Okay, so that's one thing that we need to take into account. Indeed, we need to control the CO2 emissions and probably have negative emissions, but there are other agents there that we need to take care of. Can we go to the next slide? So one way of looking at the problem and what to do about this problem, reducing those emissions, is in terms of looking at organizations in particular, but it can be applied to individuals to an extent, and think of three different scopes, three different levels or areas, rather, where we could control or put attention to those emissions. They are called in the left-hand side of the slide, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. In Scope 1, we take into account emissions that are produced by sources owned by, say, the company or the individual. So they are direct emissions. In Scope 2, we take into account those emissions that are indirectly caused. So, for example, if I have a car, my car will emit directly some CO2 if it's not electric, and therefore it's a Scope 1 emission. A Scope 2 in this case would be the electricity I use. I do not generate electricity that I use at home, but indeed, because I use electricity, that electricity in many countries has some carbon content. And in the case of a Scope 3, we talk about things that are produced outside the unit, say the company or the house, and because of transport in particular, the supply chain, travel, commuting, waste, etc., we ascribe those emissions to Scope 3. Now, in the right-hand side figure, I'm showing you the result of the analysis made by the University of Oxford a year ago, or a year and a half ago, where, as you can see, the Scope 1 emissions are a small fraction of the overall emissions in there. Okay, so the main area where a university in general, Oxford in particular, needs to work on is scope 3. And this is quite simple to explain because we are a service company. Well, it's not a company, but a service entity. We don't really manufacture things as such, and therefore most of our emissions are because, for example, people commute to work, or we travel to conferences, or we buy different things from different companies, etc. So this is where our university is concentrating as of this moment in terms of trying to reduce those emissions in a number of committees at the level of department and colleges. And just to finish my last slide on the first question, if you can move to the next slide, is just a few words about the work I do in our group, which is called Oxgate. And this group is about trying to produce or making it more feasible to produce something called green ammonia. Ammonia, by the way, so-called brown ammonia or dirty ammonia, is the second most used or produced chemical in the world because it's the basis of most fertilizers. But right now, and this is the small figure in the left, right now we produce ammonia based on fossil fuels. So the hydrogen that we need for the ammonia, which is NH3, comes from, for example, natural gas, but some other hydrocarbons, and that will emit CO2. And what we can do instead, which is the figure in the right-hand side, is to produce that ammonia from hydrogen that comes from water electrolysis. And we run this electrolysis using renewable energy. So there is, as you can see in the right-hand side figure, not a single atom of carbon, and therefore in the process per se, there is not a single CO2 molecule of green ammonia emitted. And what our group does is try to make this process more economically feasible so that companies will be interested in taking the second route rather than the first one. And with that, I'll let the second speaker go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rene. So if I took a flight and came out to Oxford, I will be driving up my scope 3 carbon emission. Is that correct? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Rene, for a very, very insightful presentation and deconstructing E. Now, next up, the alphabet S. Now, I'd like to call upon Dr. Kish to come and talk about what S stands for. Why is it being spoken about a lot now? I'm going to just share your slide. Over to you, Kish.
Thank you, Sharifah. I'll wait for my slide.
Yeah, just give me 1 second. Oh, just 1 minute.
No worries. I will start. Well, the S of ESG, and we know it by many names. It's called social pillar. Some people call it social sustainability or social impact. I call it the stepsister of the two brothers, environment and governance. And the reason being, it's less spoken about. It's less practiced in principle. It has lesser mind space than climate, the environment part. And even if it's understood in a very narrow sense of the whole philosophy behind social impact, especially in Asian countries. So to me, this stepsister is all about, the social pillar is all about managing relationships with people and communities who matter to businesses. And by rule, the priority are the stakeholders who are directly involved or associated with the business directly or indirectly, and then come the greater society. So I'll quickly examine the social pillar using 5 clicks. So Sharifah, if you can help me with my first click. And the first click is the first context, which is the workforce and labor. Excellent. So the social pillar here recognizes the workforce and labor and their right to information, their right to good health and well-being, things like freedom of movement and association, freedom of association, their right to fair remuneration, their right for learning and growth. And all of these things strengthen their motivation, their productivity, and their performance. The second click, Sharifah, is communities. So here, the focus should be on leaving no one behind. And for that, a critical consideration is how business decisions might affect communities within or beyond the ecosystem where we operate. And what strategies are being put in place to ensure these communities or such communities are least affected or they're most benefited. The third context could be, next click please, suppliers can be examined in the context of suppliers. And this can be most challenging as it requires businesses to recognize and respect the differences amongst the diverse suppliers within their value chain, and not make these differences and not take them as disadvantages or to power negotiations. So with suppliers, the social aspect covers, amongst other things, fair distribution of risks and rewards, and fair exchange and use of information to meet common objectives and as well as shared value. The next context is a context of governance, which can be examined from the point of view of all stakeholders. And here, when we talk about governance, we have to examine whether all our stakeholders are able to participate in our value chain and even more participate in decisions that affect them most, including closed loop feedback mechanisms. A quick example could be when we are devising our climate strategies, are we taking into account the the potential social impact of those decisions on communities who may be disadvantaged or communities within our ecosystem, surrounding our business, etc. So those are different things, and whether we are allowing those stakeholders to actually participate in framing our climate strategies. Yeah. So that's the context of social impact there. And the last but not the least, what will our focus on these social aspects actually achieve in terms of impact? And we need to be reminded here that it is not about charity. It is not how much we spend on suppliers or channel to community or workforce well-being. It is more about, and I keep repeating this in many of my talks, it is more about making sure our people and communities are motivated. They are in a place where they can contribute or offer support to our business mission and vision, making our growth resilient, and they're able to thrive alongside profitable businesses. Uh, One last click, please. To summarize philosophically, the S in ESG, to me, in my personal opinion, I closely link it to the theory of organizational justice or social justice. And I give a lot of emphasis on the element of fairness and inclusion. And its scope, the scope of what's fair and what's inclusive is beyond a moral obligation. It is actually, I see it as a function of risk. And if well managed, it can bring great value to not just businesses, but also stakeholders. So that ends my little brief on what S means in ESG.
Thank you very much, Kish, for putting it in the form of the palm of our hand. Yeah, that's right. So,
Right? It's not footprint, it's handprint.
handprint, yeah, exactly. So, Kish, if my boss at work made me work extra hours, does that mean that he's violating the S principle then?
Can I not comment on that?
That's a very, very safe answer. Thank you very much again. We'll come back to you shortly. Now, Datin Sri Sunita, we've all been waiting to hear from you. Take it away. Tell us, what is G?
Thank you, Sharifah. Thanks so much for having me here. So let's just recap. The concept of limited liability allows the entrepreneur to take risks while limiting his personal liability. And this has created an unprecedented creation of wealth. But it is a virtual entity. We know we can't jump out of the third floor of a building, but a virtual entity doesn't have any such limitations. And directors are the long-term stewards of this virtual entity. And so corporate governance is how companies are managed, including identifying who has responsibility, accountability, their conduct, short and long-term incentives to ensure interests are aligned, and directors have a duty to act in the best interests of the company. And these best practices have evolved over decades to refine this responsibility. And at this stage, we need independent directors to be the majority of the board, and the chairman should ideally be independent as well. But as recently as 1970, we could have a Nobel Prize winner, Milton Friedman, declare in the New York Times op ed that the only responsibility of a company is to generate returns for its shareholders. And this is still a strongly held view by many investors today. Social license to operate is limited by some people to instances like rare earth mining or nuclear operations. But because there is increasing knowledge about the impacts businesses have on their multiple stakeholders, including its workers and the environment, this social license to operate has extended to all companies and gathered significant momentum. So today, we have allocators of capital, such as bankers, investors, insurers, reinsurers. They are demanding for increased reporting and disclosure because they want to assess if more capital needs to be allocated to that business or industry or country, or should capital be diverted away from these places. So, in short, has the business accurately identified the material risks they are facing and demonstrating that they are able to manage them? Because businesses are so complex now. And even if the business is simple, the world is increasingly so complex. And so you need to take a risk based approach. You have to establish risk appetite and materiality. You even have to identify matters which have double materiality or dynamic materiality. And the recent emphasis includes ethics and corruption, for example, and my personal passion, climate governance, because as informed by science, the climate crisis is an existential risk. Back to you, Sharifah.
Thank you very much, Datin. You said so much in so few words, and that's amazing. That's remarkable. So we've got some questions, and we're going to come back to you. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like to ask Rene. Somehow the E seems to be taking a lot of weight in E, S, and G. So Rene, what does this E mean for everyday life, for people like you and me, for workers, for students? What does it mean? What's your thought on it?
Yes, I think I'll use again a very common phrase used in the area of sustainability. It means that we need to be very aware of how we can reduce the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. So part of the problem is that this society we live in is a society where consumption is king, if you want to put it this way. Many people would like to have a new car every couple of years, etc., etc. But I think we need again to concentrate on how much we can achieve this reduction of consumption. First of all, reusing things, that is repairing them, and the recycled part instead of just throwing away in the waste. So that's, say, the general idea. Now, in terms of very specific actions, I think, first of all, we need to change our consumer habits. I'll pick only one example, but there are so many of these. We know that a lot of the problem with CO2 emission is land use change, and that's caused because more than half of the land that we use to grow crops goes into feeding animals, that is beef, cattle, etc. And therefore, if we only change, at least partially, our diet, we can help a lot the environment. So going into being vegetarian, it's a great idea, I think. But even if one has 1 or 2 vegetarian days a week, that will make a very, very big difference. Okay. There is the avoiding waste. Things are over packaged. definitely in Europe and the US, but I think this is a general thing. Clothes, they can be mended, recycled, equipment, computers, for example, instead of changing a computer every 2 years, maybe we can just upgrade it, etc. Reducing unnecessary travel. So I'm very appreciative that this seminar, is being given using this technology, rather than having to invite people from different countries to have a seminar. So in the last few years, I don't accept every invitation I get, because sometimes it's just better to do it this way. But let me just finish with this. I think that while we as individuals can make a big difference, and definitely we should try to do that, we need to be aware that most of the reason why things happen is because also big corporations are doing some of these emissions. So I think that the most important thing we can do as individuals is to become an active citizen and an active consumer, become an activist in these areas. So yes, we can change our own behavior, but actually affecting in the society. This connects with the social part a lot. Is very, very important.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. I'm going to actually throw a very contentious question, but that's going to be my way to segue to Kish. So, Rene, you mentioned about let's go vegetarian 1 or 2 nights, or vegan, in fact. So, if I did this, am I going to be making people who actually work in the dairy farms or even the poultry industry, they're going to lose jobs? Kish, what's your take on that, Kish?
Well,
And
so
also,
my
Kish, if you may want to add on, what's the risk also of ignoring the S factor? Over to you.
Cool. So I have been vegan for the past 15 years, and I work at a dairy company. And I always say this to people that don't be vegan because it's fashionable. Be vegan because you want to know the source from where your products come from, and whether those sources are ethically managing the raw materials, products, animals, whatever is the product. So if it's being managed responsibly, and if you can see it, if you know enough about it, it's okay to be not vegan. Yeah. If I don't know my source, yeah, I will be vegan. Yeah. So that's the approach I have been preaching to my friends and within my own circle. So I think, and I've been vegan for 15 years, not but by choice. Uh, and no, I'm not killing anybody's jobs. I'm just making sure that companies, as a consumer, I'm making sure the brands I'm loyal to, they understand that there's a certain level of expectation from me as a consumer. Yeah. Okay, cool. So going back to your question of companies not, the risk of companies not looking at social pillar. As shared before, I see it beyond a moral obligation. It is not about taking care of the people, giving back to society. I don't take that angle. It is I see the social aspect as a function of risk. And if I can quote some examples from S&P Global, and one very good example is about how companies' workforce requirements and composition actually can potentially create problems for the organization in the form of, let's say, labor strikes, consumer protests, could be about a high attrition rate, and all of these actually create scarcity of skilled employees, skilled labor force, affecting companies' profitability. Another example could be of the high exposure to geopolitical conflicts in our supply chains, and this also affects us in Dutch Lady because we have high reliance on supply chain, and it leads to very high volatility in business. So business supplier relationships well managed, and when I say well managed, when you're sensitive to the rights and responsibilities and the needs of our suppliers, we are able to build a more resilient supply chain. And if not, then of course there is high business volatility. Another example could be the safety issues related to products. If I can quote the classic 2008, the China melamine milk issue, where the chemical melamine was directly linked to kidney damage and kidney stones in infants. So that is, again, there is a social impact associated with your product, and there was a clear safety issue. So So when you ignore these kind of things, the kind of impact that your products or services could have on people and communities, yes, there is a reputational issue, but there are also ethical as well as financial issues in terms of punitive damages. Another example, there are many examples. Another example could be the demographic and consumer changes. Their expectations, and we've seen during COVID how the demographic, the consumer behavior changed in principle, uh, and that could shrink the market for a company's products and services. At Dutch Lady, I think the consumer behavior shifted more in favor of healthy, nutritious diet and food. People had more time away in a virtual environment where they were more careful about their physical and mental well-being. So though that worked favorably for Dutch Lady, but it's not always the case. So you have to be very mindful under social impact pillar about the demographic and consumer changes that could actually how it could impact your business negatively. And of course, the last thing is the complex social dynamics that could emanate from online public opinions, uh, a lot of activism from NGOs, physical strikes, company boycotts. All of these things do affect long-term shifts in consumer preferences, and decision makers can consider these as important indicators of the company's potential to grow and to create a positive impact in society. So these are some of the risks of not looking at social pillar. Uh, and of course, on the climate side, if when you're devising your climate risk strategies, if you ignore the impact of those strategies on communities, disadvantaged communities, not the elite communities, of course, the chances of your climate strategies uh, recourse or failure, or you having to do course correction along the way, which could be super expensive. So all these are some of the things that could potentially happen if you ignore the social pillar. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. And we should actually put a lot of message out there also that the food that we eat, the amount of sugar that goes into our food has created a lot of the health issues we're facing. You touched on governance. I want to now pivot over to Datin Sri Sunita. So we speak about governance. Datin Sri Sunita has been doing a lot of work in the climate governance space. I hear there's huge liabilities coming out. Datin Sri, tell us a little bit more about climate governance. Whose responsibility is it, Datin Sri?
Well, firstly, it's viewed as a classic market failure, where the polluter profits and the rest of society has to bear the loss and damage. So there's a sense of inequity if, for example, the countries responsible for the majority of emissions are not funding the mitigation or adaptation efforts that are needed, or if these countries are continuing to outsource their emissions footprint and environmental destruction to other countries. Further, intergenerational inequity is also strongly felt, where the young feel helpless. They can't vote, they don't have power, they don't have access to funding, versus the adults who don't seem to be acting as quickly, as urgently as needed. So, at the most basic level, the presumption is on reporting and disclosure. This is the first thing that reporting entities are supposed to do. It is the responsibility of the business to disclose the material risk it is facing and how it is being managed. And there are many frameworks and standards, many of which are now becoming game changers as well. But then you also see increasing levels of ambition, where businesses are not only embedding sustainability into the DNA of the business, from product design to circularity of the products, even after their useful life, to deeply considering the impacts of the business on the environment as well, and even planetary boundaries, such as the chemicals and aerosols and microplastics which are being generated. And further, many thought leaders within the business community, and we're seeing this with Climate Governance Malaysia, CEO Action Network, they're also seeing the opportunity to not only widen the gap between leaders and laggards. There are many businesses who still don't fully understand the enormity of this crisis, and they want to contribute to policy making as a social responsibility, because this crisis requires an all of government and whole of society approach. And so this is why we've created a platform for engagement. I'm hoping this will be extended to the financial institution directors, alumni soon, because let me put this into context. We've just experienced the warmest January on record since 1850. and the lowest Antarctic sea ice extent for January, despite a prolonged La Nina influence in the tropical Pacific. Now, this is demonstrating the powerful role played by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Many don't consider the 1.5 degrees warming target to be feasible because we're already at 1.2 degrees of warming. The world is currently headed for, depending on which reports you read, 2.4 degrees or 2.7 degrees. So we are definitely not aligned to Paris, which all countries in the world agreed to in December 2015. Now, simulations indicate that even if we can limit emissions, it might be insufficient to prevent accelerated sea level rise. And this is why the United Nations Security Council just had their first session to discuss security risks arising from sea level rise, for example, climate refugees. The World Bank president is leaving his post. So these are huge, huge problems, and the situation is further complicated if you are a next net exporting nation like Malaysia, where consumers beyond our borders have outsourced their carbon footprint, their emissions footprint, their environmental destruction to us, but they're not paying full value for the preservation or protection or replacement of these services. And in this country, we have mixed or ineffectual signaling. Fuel at the pump is subsidized. And in almost every country in the world, carbon taxes or carbon pricing in isolation is not effective. You need a raft of policies to carefully, intelligently, impactfully signal the direction of travel that we want, which is a smooth and just transition. And so responsible directors need to be fully informed about this climate emergency, which is simple enough for children to understand and yet sufficiently complex and nuanced that everybody needs to weigh in on this conversation. Back to you, Sharifah.
Well said, well said. Thank you so much. We have got a vibrant chat happening among our audience. You've alluded us to a lot, the importance of making that change. Now, I want to pick Mark Disney's question. To what extent is ESG being used as a form of greenwashing for corporations? Rene, I'd like you to take that question. And then there's another question on just transition, which I'm going to send over to Datin Sri. How do we ensure just transition? So Rene, over to you on greenwashing. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there is a lot of truth in that certain corporations, organizations use this as one way. I mean, it's even worse than greenwashing. It's accessing funds that governments had put in order to greening the economy and actually creating even more damage by doing that. I won't say the name of the oil and gas company, but it's not the only one. And it's not the Malaysian one, by the way, where in fact they capture CO2, which is something we should be doing, and they put it underground. So it's carbon capture and storage. But what they don't say, or they say in very little, letters, is that they do that in order to have something called secondary oil recovery. So sometimes you have oil that, unless you put a fluid to push that oil and recover it, that oil will be kept there. So they're using CO2 to push the oil out. And once they push it, of course, they sell it. And they're charging to separate the CO2 and pump it underground, but because they're making more profits and contaminate more than otherwise. So that's, and they got money from government in order to do this project. I find it a scam. It's terrible. That is an extreme situation. In some of the cases, it's just greenwashing, saying, "Oh, yes, we produce the CO2, but we offset it in the Amazon," but it's really not happening many times. So, unfortunately, it is true. It can be a bit of or a lot of greenwashing, but one needs to be informed, attentive, and precisely try to identify these situations and alert governments or consumers about this.
Yeah, indeed. It is actually happening a lot. And I like that the question came out here because it's only when we speak at platforms like this and the more and more people will become aware. Another term that has come up is green wishing. So sometimes they say, no, not greenwashing, but green wishing. Datin Sri, how do we move, how do we implement a just transition?
So the efforts that are needed right now is not just mitigation, where we decarbonize the economy, and adaptation, where we increase our climate resilience, but it is also about preserving carbon sinks, preserving our biodiversity, ensuring that ecosystems are adequately valued as well. Because all of this is going to have a huge cost of loss of lives, damage to property, extinction of species. So, as I explain very often, it doesn't matter if you're a multi award winning reporting entity, but if you don't have food security, if there are going to be supply chain blockages, then what does it matter? Allocators of capital will have to divert capital away from your business or industry or country. So a smooth and a just transition is something where everyone needs to be involved in the conversation, as many stakeholders as possible. You want to be able to crowdsource for simple, elegant, cost-effective, hyper-localized solutions. Inevitable policy responses, which we are going to see, are needed to urgently decarbonize the economy and drastically reduce the extraction from the environment, for example, zero deforestation, but it also needs to take into account the impact on vulnerable households. So, for example, if there's going to be carbon taxes or pricing, we need to have sharply defined subsidies, targeted subsidies, ensure that there isn't much leakage, ensure that there isn't runaway inflation. And why are we doing all of this? Because a smooth and a just transition to this warmer world, which is inevitable, as we're already seeing, is simply the right thing to do. Back to you,
Okay,
Sari.
yeah, that's true. And I think you hit quite a few of the questions that came up on the chat about, as the global population grow, and then there's more need for housing, for building. How do we actually control the decreasing number of green land? Right. So, Kish, do you want to take a stab at that? But I'm going to pack it with another question because we just spoke about greenwashing, green wishing. There's a question from the floor here also asking, are we going to be able to meet the 17 SDGs, or are we being too ambitious? So two questions for you, Kish.
Okay. So I have a view on. I mean, there's a global debate on what actually qualifies as greenwashing or green wishing or green hushing. There's also something called green hushing, where businesses have stopped communicating about their green agenda as a policy because they fear that they will be called out. Uh, and my position on that is, if companies are making tall claims and disclosing numbers without addressing the real issues, that's when you can say it's greenwashing. So, and that's important to acknowledge that. Yeah, substantiating with evidence on how you have addressed a social issue or an environmental issue, which is well within your control and power as a business. Yeah, if you don't do that, and if you make tall claims and publicize some numbers, that's what greenwashing is all about. It's very clear. Uh, and coming to, what was your next question?
On the SDGs, are we being too
SDGs.
ambitious?
It depends. Ambitious from what, I mean, where you're sitting on the hill, right? Where you're sitting on at what level you're actually viewing this whole thing from. So as a business, if I look within my own ecosystem, if I look at within the my own the impacts that are within my control, what strategies I can change, etc. And I keep quoting this analogy of, you can't. I, as a business, for example, at Dash Lady, I probably we can decide within a year to come up, invest some millions of dollars in a new technology that will cut down the use of water by 50%. But within the same year, I can't grow a whole forest. Yeah. So growing forests within a year is impossible. But within my control as a business is that within that year, I can make some positive changes to ensure I'm reducing my water use. So I use this analogy because I say that if every single business looks at their own immediate impacts, and looks at how they are tied to certain priority SDGs, I don't think uh, it's far from achievable. I don't think it is far from achievable. Yeah.
Okay, okay, yeah.
It's one business at a time. It's not about saving the planet. If you examine the impact from the context of your own business, one business at a time, it it will seem very achievable and within the power of CEOs and boards.
Yes, yes, definitely. I think we took it one step at a time, right? Collective effort. I've got one controversial question, and because we've got a speaker sitting on the developed market in the UK, Prof. Rene, you would have heard of the case of one of our glove making company that was penalized because they did not take into consideration the well-being of workers during COVID. And so there were great sanctions placed on them. Now, do you think this would have been done if that company was operating in a developed market compared to a developing market like Malaysia? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I unfortunately do not know the case you're mentioning, but from your description, I think that there is. I come also from a country that is very similar to Malaysia, Mexico, in many ways. My experience is that workers are not as protected in. I can talk about Mexico, in Mexico as opposed to say Europe or the US in this case. I think this is unfortunately the case.
Yeah.
So, but I cannot comment about the Malaysia case because I don't know.
Yeah, it's something that actually sits in a lot of these debates. Right. So thanks so much for your honest view on that. I'm actually keeping look at time, and we are actually down to the last 4 minutes. So what I'd like to do is I'd like each speaker to give a one or two closing remarks, okay, and speak also about what's next. So maybe we can start with Datin Sri Sunita. What do you think is round the corner? What should we be preparing for from a G perspective?
So, in terms of climate governance, what we're seeing around the corner is the wave of climate litigation. Businesses, directors are going to be in the front line because the causality is so well established that the data relating to science, emissions, warming, extreme weather events leading to loss and damage, that is going to be almost impossible to deny. It's so self-evident that the presumption, if you do not make any disclosure, is that the board has applied its mind to these risks and concluded it is not material. So this is definitely the next wave that's going to be coming up, not just with businesses, with governments, and anyone really who is perceived to have this responsibility is in the line of fire.
Okay, thank you very much. Kish, would you like to tell us what is coming in the S side?
I think there's a lot of pressure from everywhere, especially from stakeholders. Critical stakeholders of business, that we need to acknowledge that everyone has rights and responsibilities, and that means shunning all forms of discrimination and ensuring there's fairness and transparent governance, and the way in which our stakeholders participate in various decisions that bring value to business, that make it profitable, and ensure we are also taking care of their welfare and well-being, and whatever, and growth is meaningful for all stakeholders to business. So I think that activism on the social side, I think it's growing, and if we of course there are consequences if we clearly ignore that, in terms of the motivation of stakeholders to continue to add value to our business and contribute to our growth.
Thank you very much. And Rene, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think I would like to take the very last question I see on the private chat here.
Go ahead.
Because it's very much what I think is coming around the corner. Question is profit versus ESG, which comes first is the question. And I really don't see a contradiction between the two. In fact, as of this moment, the cheapest energy we can generate is renewable energy, which 20 years ago, people would have said, oh, yeah, that's wonderful. solar panels, etc., but are so expensive, they never will compete with fossil fuels. As of this moment, that energy is much cheaper than fossil fuels, than nuclear energy, so on and so forth. So because technologies are, improving there, and therefore that's one result. And a very recent study from some colleagues here in Oxford, and they just published it. In fact, they say, people have said that this change is going to cost money. It's going to, where are we going to get the money? In fact, it will generate many jobs and save money, so on and so forth. My second thought has to do with geographical distribution. I think, again, this renewable energy, in particular solar, which is going to become cheaper and cheaper, much faster than wind, but solar and wind is, any country that has solar and wind energy can generate green hydrogen, green ammonia, etc., and use those as fuels, so on and so forth. And that, to me, that's a great opportunity for developing countries, such as mine, Mexico, such as yours, Malaysia, whereby, in both cases, we have oil and gas as countries, but shifting to this other sort of economy is not necessarily going to be, a loss in income. And for other countries in Africa with no oil and gas, in fact, it's an opportunity for them to generate their own power and fuels and so on and so forth. So I may be a bit idealistic, but I think this, in the end, will, if we have enough time, will come out of it much stronger and better than the current situation that is very unequal, around the world. So that would be my positive, hopefully, view on this. What's around the corner?
Very much optimistic, in fact, and I like what you said about a lot more opportunities that can come out, and that probably hits one of the questions that our audience had about job losses in fossil fuel. There will be opportunities that will come up in the new greener economy. So on that note, speakers, thank you very much for such an exciting, interesting 1 hour. 1 hour doesn't do justice. We can go on and on, but I hope that our audience have gotten a better understanding of each of the alphabet, E, S, and G. We'd like to thank you on behalf of the society for your time today. And thank you to all the audience that kept the chat room so vibrant and lively. We hope that these questions are things that we all will talk about, and soon we'll find answers to it. So now I'm going to hand it over to Sean, the president, to close the webinar. Over to you, Sean.
Hi. Yeah, I think that was an impactful session, and I think I have personally increased my awareness of ESG now. So on behalf of the society, I would once again like to express our thanks to the speakers for the enlightening session, and Sharifah, you of course for organizing this, and Hema, which you don't see on screen but is in the backstage monitoring the chat, and finally, of course, all of you, the audience, for tuning in. Have a good day or good night, depending on where you are, and see you at our next event. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.